March 7, 2025, a man strapped to a chair, a target placed over his heart, and a firing squad waiting 15 feet away. After 20 years on death row, Brad Keith Sigmon's life ended in a way that's almost unheard of today. But how did he go from a failed relationship to one of the most shocking crimes in South Carolina's history? And why did Sigmon choose the firing squad over other methods? To understand his journey, we need to go back to the beginning, where obsession and violence set this tragic chain in motion. To understand why Sigmon ended up in that chair, we need to look back at the events that set everything in motion. What drives a person to commit a brutal crime against a family they once knew? Brad Keith Sigmon's path toward violence began with the unraveling of his 3-year relationship with Rebecca "Becky" Lark. Their time living together in a trailer just outside Greenville, South Carolina, had once seemed stable, but by 2001, mounting frustrations and arguments led Becky to a difficult decision. She ended the relationship and moved out. Wanting space and a fresh start, Becky returned to her parents' trailer next door. This physical move was meant to be a clear boundary, but the close proximity made it impossible for Sigmon to ignore her absence or move on. The separation became official when Becky's father, David Lark, served Sigmon with eviction papers, giving him 2 weeks to leave the property. For Sigmon, this was more than a legal notice. It was a personal blow that deepened his sense of rejection and loss. While Becky tried to regain her independence, Sigmon's response was marked by growing distress. He struggled to accept the end of the relationship, and his behavior quickly shifted from sadness to obsession. In the weeks that followed, Sigmon's actions became increasingly troubling. He started watching Becky's parents' home from a distance, often standing outside and staring at her front door. He would follow her movements, making his presence known in ways that unsettled Becky and her family. According to reports, Becky became fearful when she saw Sigmon at her door or outside her window, and she made it clear she wanted no contact. Despite her efforts to set boundaries, Sigmon refused to let go, clinging to the hope that he could somehow regain control over the situation. Sigmon's fixation only grew when he began to suspect that Becky might be seeing someone new. Whether this suspicion was accurate or not, it became a driving force behind his escalating jealousy and frustration. The thought of Becky moving on with another person fueled his resentment and made it even harder for him to accept reality. Instead of confronting his own emotions or seeking help, Sigmon allowed these feelings to shape his actions, pushing him further into a pattern of obsessive and controlling behavior. Around this time, Sigmon's emotional state deteriorated further. He started confiding in his friend, Eugene Strew, during nights spent drinking and using crack cocaine. In one of these conversations, Sigmon revealed a disturbing plan. He intended to go to the Lark family's trailer, tie up David and Gladys Lark, and wait for Becky to return. His goal was to kidnap Becky and flee with her, believing this would force her back into his life. This plan marked a clear shift from obsessive thoughts to premeditated violence, showing that Sigmon was willing to endanger others to satisfy his need for control. The warning signs were visible in both Sigmon's words and actions. Friends and family noticed his erratic behavior, but the full extent of his intentions was not clear until he spoke openly about his plan. Becky, meanwhile, did everything she could to protect herself, relying on her family's support and trying to maintain distance. Despite her efforts, the tension in the neighborhood grew, and those closest to the situation sensed that something was very wrong. Sigmon's inability to cope with rejection and loss had now transformed into a dangerous obsession. His focus was no longer on reconciling with Becky, but on forcing her to comply with his demands, regardless of the consequences. The emotional turmoil that followed the breakup had given way to a willingness to use violence as a means of regaining power over his life and over Becky. By April 27, 2001, his obsession turned lethal. What happened that morning changed everything. Violence erupted in the Lark family's Greenville County home on April 27, 2001, in a way that would leave a lasting mark on the community. Brad Keith Sigmon arrived at the residence armed with a baseball bat, determined to carry out a plan he had developed over weeks of growing obsession. Becky Lark had already left to take her children to school, leaving her parents, David and Gladys Lark, to start their morning routine. Sigmon's friend, Eugene Strew, who had driven him to the house, quickly realized what Sigmon intended and left immediately, distancing himself from what was about to unfold. Inside the trailer, Sigmon wasted no time. David Lark, sensing trouble, tried to act, telling his wife Gladys to get a gun. She never had the chance. Sigmon attacked David first, striking him repeatedly with the bat. He then turned on Gladys, chasing her into the living room and continuing the assault. Medical examiners later determined each victim suffered multiple crushing blows and died over several agonizing minutes. The violence was deliberate and left a scene that investigators would later describe as one of the most severe in their experience. After the attack, Sigmon did not flee. Instead, he remained inside the blood-stained trailer, waiting for Becky to return. His plan was not only to kill her parents, but also to kidnap Becky, hoping to force her back into his life. When Becky arrived home, Sigmon ambushed her, threatening her with a gun and forcing her into her car. As he tried to take control, Becky seized a moment to escape. She opened the car door and tried to run. Sigmon fired, hitting her, but Becky continued to flee and managed to call 911 for help. Becky's quick actions were critical. Her call to authorities provided immediate information about the attack and the identity of the assailant. Responding officers arrived at the Lark home and discovered the bodies of David and Gladys. The evidence at the scene, combined with Becky's account, allowed investigators to quickly piece together the events and link Sigmon to the crime. The brutality of the murders and the attempt on Becky's life became central points in the subsequent investigation and prosecution. During the trial, prosecutors relied on forensic evidence and medical testimony to show the extent of the violence. They described how the blunt force trauma caused devastating injuries and how the attack was planned rather than impulsive. The defense argued that Sigmon's background, marked by addiction and a troubled upbringing, should be considered, but the jury focused on the severity and premeditation of the acts. On July 20, 2002, Sigmon was sentenced to death for the murders of David and Gladys Lark. The outcome brought a sense of closure for some, but it also marked the beginning of a long legal process. Sigmon's conviction led to years of appeals and reviews, as the case moved through the courts and the state's execution procedures evolved. For more than 2 decades, Sigmon remained on death row, his fate uncertain as legal battles and changes in execution methods delayed the final outcome. Understanding what life was like for Brad Keith Sigmon during those years on death row sheds light on the complexities of the justice system and the impact of prolonged waiting, not just for Sigmon, but for the families and communities affected by his actions. Brad Keith Sigmon's time on death row stretched across more than 2 decades, defined by routine, isolation, and an ever-present sense of uncertainty. Each day followed a strict pattern. Sigmon spent nearly all his hours confined to a 6 by 10-foot cell, eating, sleeping, and exercising in the same small space. Human contact was minimal. Interactions with other inmates were rare, and time outside was limited to brief periods in a secure, fenced area. Over the years, this environment became his entire world, one marked by monotony and a sense of suspended reality. Sigmon's prolonged wait for execution was not unique to him, but it was shaped by specific circumstances in South Carolina. After his sentencing in 2002, he entered the lengthy appeals process, a system designed to ensure fairness and provide opportunities to challenge a conviction or sentence. Yet, the most significant factor delaying his execution was the state's moratorium on executions, which began in 2011. South Carolina, like many other states, faced a shortage of lethal injection drugs when pharmaceutical companies refused to supply them for executions. Without access to the necessary drugs, executions came to a standstill. For years, Sigmon and others on death row watched as legal debates continued and the state struggled to find a solution. During this period, lawmakers in South Carolina debated alternatives. In 2021, they passed legislation reinstating the electric chair and adding the firing squad as execution methods. For Sigmon, These changes meant that even as his legal appeals continued, the conversation shifted toward how, not if, the sentence would be carried out. The uncertainty of waiting, never knowing when a date might be set or which method would be used, added another layer of psychological strain. The psychological effects of such a long wait are well documented. Living under a death sentence for years, with no clear end in sight, can lead to chronic anxiety, depression, and a sense of hopelessness. Sigmon himself described his experience as living in suspended reality, caught between the past and an uncertain future. The isolation of death row, combined with the knowledge that each legal development could bring him closer to execution, weighed heavily on him. Days often blurred together, marked only by the occasional visit from an attorney or a rare family member. For many inmates, this kind of prolonged solitude takes a toll on mental health, making each year feel longer than the last. The emotional impact of these delays extended beyond Sigmon. For Becky Lark, the years of appeals and postponed executions meant that the pain of losing her parents was never far from the surface. She spoke openly about her grief, saying, "I miss my mama and daddy," a reminder of the lasting effects of the crime and the drawn-out legal process. Each new court date or appeal forced her and her family to revisit the trauma, making closure difficult to achieve. The families of inmates also lived with uncertainty, knowing that the end would come eventually, but never quite knowing when. As the legal and logistical hurdles were finally overcome, Sigmon's execution date was set for March 7, 2025. The announcement marked the end of years of waiting. In the days leading up to his execution, Sigmon was moved to a holding area where he spent his final hours with his attorney, preparing for what was to come. The prospect of facing the firing squad, the method he ultimately chose, became his last focus. After decades in solitude, Sigmon faced his last choice, the firing squad. What did he do next? What do a person's final words and actions reveal about their state of mind? For Brad Keith Sigmon, his last moments were a mix of routine acts, personal reflection, and the unmistakable weight of finality. Facing a death he had awaited for more than 2 decades, he began his last evening with a request common to death row inmates, a final meal. Sigmon's chosen meal was modest but indulgent. 4 pieces of KFC fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. It was the kind of comforting food many might order without a second thought, yet in the context of his imminent death, it carried an undeniable significance. That same night, Sigmon requested enough portions to share with other inmates on death row, although reports vary as to whether that request was granted. His choice to offer what would have been his last act of generosity suggests an attempt, however symbolic, to connect with or provide for others in his final hours. This meal, so ordinary on the surface, highlighted the stark contrast between the mundane and the extraordinary. Eating a meal one last time seems almost trivial, something routine that millions do daily. But for Sigmon, it marked one of his last acts as a living person, a final ritual before an irreversible event. His ability to choose this meal underscored the odd juxtaposition death row presents, where someone condemned to lose their life is briefly allowed simple comforts before they are taken away forever. After the meal, Sigmon was moved into the execution chamber at South Carolina's Broad River Correctional Institution. At 6 p.m. on March 7, 2025, he was secured to the chair that would hold him in place during the firing squad execution. Witness accounts describe the room as tense, with each small movement taking on significant weight. Sigmon addressed a few final words to those present. His final statement revealed his internal struggles, his beliefs, and his attempt to make meaning of his impending death. He directed part of his message to his loved ones with a clear sentiment of love and farewell. Yet his words carried a broader message, one that was unmistakably focused on his opposition to the death penalty itself. Quoting scripture, Sigmon condemned the application of an eye for an eye, stating, "An eye for an eye was used as justification to the jury for seeking the death penalty. Why? Because we no longer live under the Old Testament law, but now live under the New Testament." His words challenged the morality of capital punishment, using his faith as a lens to argue against it. This statement, made only minutes before his death, suggests a man who had spent years integrating his religious beliefs with the stark reality of his crime and its consequences. Sigmon's plea was not just personal, it was aimed at sparking reflection on the broader system that had landed him in this moment. As the room settled, Sigmon was prepared for the execution. A black hood was gently placed over his head to block the view of his face, reducing any lingering connection between the witnesses and the person being executed. A circular target was secured against his chest, directly over his heart, giving the firing squad a precise mark. For 2 minutes, silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of Sigmon's heavy breaths under the hood. Witnesses describe this period as unbearable in its intensity, every moment building toward the command to fire. Some present reported seeing Sigmon subtly mouth the words, "I'm okay," to his attorney just before the shots rang out. Whether intended as a moment of reassurance or resignation, this gesture reflected an unusual calmness at a time when most would be consumed by fear or despair. The execution was carried out by 3 riflemen using rifles loaded with 308 Winchester rounds, each shooter positioned behind a wall with small openings to obscure their faces. In following protocol, one of the rifles was loaded with blanks, providing a layer of psychological detachment for the participants. The warden read the execution order aloud, and a single command released 3 bullets simultaneously, each striking the target over Sigmon's heart. Reports described the immediate aftermath as gruesome but fast. The paper targets used to mark the chest were blown clean off by the force of the impact. For a moment, Sigmon appeared to take 1 or 2 shallow breaths as blood spread from the wounds on his chest, forming a dark red bloom that quickly grew still. In less than a minute, his body went motionless. At 6:08 p.m., after a doctor stepped forward to confirm there were no signs of life, Brad Keith Sigmon was pronounced dead. He was 67 years old, making him the oldest person executed in South Carolina since the death penalty was reinstated in the state. The room that had held so much tension fell silent after the announcement. For witnesses, the moment stretched beyond the physical act, forcing a reckoning with their own feelings about what they had observed. Some described the event as cold and methodical, while others remarked on the shocking finality of the process. For those outside the chamber, Sigmon's execution, carried out by a firing squad, something almost unheard of in modern times, will likely remain a symbol of the fraught debates over justice, morality, and the role of capital punishment. Its finality served as both a conclusion and a question mark, leaving behind the broader implications of a system built to carry out irreversible decisions. The execution of Brad Keith Sigmon highlights the enduring complexities surrounding the death penalty. While some view capital punishment as necessary for justice in extreme cases, others argue it risks irrevocable harm, especially with methods like the firing squad, which feel both archaic and divisive. Sigmon's case also underscores the emotional toll such punishments take, not only on the families of victims, but on the broader society tasked with carrying out these irreversible decisions. As debates continue, alternatives like life without parole challenge us to consider whether justice is better served through punishment or by preserving life, even in darkness. The firing squad execution that ended Brad Keith Sigmon's life stands out as one of the rarest and most controversial events in recent American criminal justice. South Carolina's decision to bring back this method was not rooted in tradition, but in necessity. The state, like many others, struggled for years to obtain the drugs required for lethal injections. Pharmaceutical companies refused to supply these drugs for executions, effectively halting the process. In response, lawmakers reinstated the electric chair and added the firing squad as alternatives, aiming to ensure executions could still move forward despite these obstacles. This move sparked immediate debate. The firing squad, seen by many as a relic, became the focus of renewed ethical and legal scrutiny. Critics call it brutal. Supporters argue it's more reliable than previous botched injections. The public reaction was mixed, with some seeing it as a step backward and others as a practical solution to a complicated problem. Regardless of opinion, executions by firing squad remain extremely rare in the United States. Only a handful have occurred since the 1970s, with the last U.S. firing squad in 2010. Cases like this reveal how the search for justice can be long and difficult, and remind us how capital cases can take decades to reach closure. If you found this breakdown of Brad Keith Sigmon's case insightful, let us know in the comments and subscribe for more legal journey stories.